The opinions and statements expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of WWDB, its staff, or management.
Good day, everyone. Welcome again to another edition of Boomer Generation Radio. This is your host, Richard Address, coming to you from the studios of WWDB AM 860 on the AM dial here in Greater Philadelphia and streaming live on WWDBAM.com. Here on Boomer Generation Radio. Just a reminder that if you want to give us an idea, suggestion, a comment on the show, please email us at boomergenerationradio@gmail.com. This portion of Boomer Generation Radio is brought to you by Kendal, a system of not-for-profit communities and services located in 8 states in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and near Midwest regions of the United States. Kendal advocates for and empowers older adults to reach their full potential and is committed to working with others to together transform the experience of aging. To learn more about Kendal, that's Kendal, visit kendal.org or call them toll-free at 888-759-0128. That's 888-759-0128. And it is a pleasure to welcome to our microphones on this Kendal segment of Boomer Generation Radio. I hope they're there from far away, I think, in New Hampshire, I think. Clint and Mary, are you there?
Yes, this is Clint Gardner, and I'm sitting next to Mary Jenkins.
How you doing? You're from you're calling in from New Hampshire, right? I hope.
We are calling from New Hampshire, yes.
Right, all right, I got that right.
In a Kendal apartment.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for joining us here on Boomer Generation Radio at the Kendal segment. And we want to welcome you because I've been looking forward to this conversation, working with you. This book that you're involved with, World War II Remembered, why don't you just briefly walk us through what is this book, how did it get started, and just tell us a little bit about it. And if I remember correctly, you got yourself on NBC Nightly News with this, correct?
Yes, why don't I let Mary Jenkins tell you a bit about the book, because I believe later you'd like to hear something about my experience at Buchenwald.
Well, yes, and you know, this fits in perfectly with yesterday being Memorial Day and then the 70th anniversary of D-Day coming up next week. So this is a perfect opportunity to talk about some of these experiences. But Mary, welcome, and Mary, give us some history about this book. Why and where and how come?
Good morning, Richard. Well, Clint was the one who started it all. He was having a Veteran Day lunch in the fall of '09 with some friends, and they were talking about how fun it would be to pull some memories together. And Clint was the one who then went to work right after that luncheon, collected 6 other people, so 7 of us, 4 men and 3 women, worked for 2 years collecting 56 memoirs of residents here at Kendal, war memories, all kinds of memories. We had guys who'd been wounded, those who'd been captured, sailors who'd had to abandon ship, early SEALs, a woman who was in the WASPs, which is the Women's Pilot Group, another woman who had taught Japanese to people who will ultimately be occupying Japan. Another woman had been a secretary to Edward Stettinius and been out in San Francisco at the time that the UN was started. And really a fabulous group of people. So we put this all together, and then in the fall of 11, we self-published. We printed 50 copies, and we ran around taking them to libraries and bookstores, talking to people, retirement homes all over the place, and selling very successfully. That Thanksgiving time, the day after Thanksgiving, I back up. My husband and I had some friends of many years standing in Connecticut, and they had sent us self-published memoirs, which each of them had done. So when the book came out, since both my husband and I had stories in it, I sent them a copy. The day after Christmas, Pat, the woman, called me, and she said, Mary, yesterday our daughter and her husband came for Thanksgiving dinner, and my son-in-law picked up the book. He was enthralled by it, and I'd given him your email. Is that okay? I said, of course. Her son-in-law was Brian Williams.
Oh.
So from then on, the crew came here in January and interviewed 4 of us, and then we appeared, of course, on the news for a 4-minute bit
Wow.
in February. And exciting for us. Of course, for 24 hours, we were number 6 on Amazon bestsellers. Of course, we didn't stay there, but it was very nice. And in the meantime, of course, I before we actually went on Brian Williams, we realized that we weren't going to be able to handle this, operating out of the trunk of the car, delivering books. So we went over to University Press of New England, UPNI as they're called, and to see if they could advise us. And then instead of just advising us, they took the book. So they took over the printing and they took over the marketing, and it was a wonderful break for us. And at this moment, we have sold over 10,000 books.
Wow.
And we earned $53,000, which we gave to a thing called the Cadbury Fund here at Kendal. It's a fund created to help residents who have trouble paying their monthly fees.
Mm-hmm.
So that's essentially the story of the book, and it's a very exciting one for us.
So when you have 56 stories, right, in this book?
56 stories, correct.
So when you come to a period of time in the calendar like now, Memorial Day, D-Day's anniversary, can you, either one of you or both of you, what goes through your mind? What comes through your soul? How are you transported back, or is it? What do you feel? What do you feel?
Well, it's easy to answer because the local press has begun to interview us with the 70th anniversary of D-Day coming up, and for me, it's. I sometimes wonder whether I might get some very long delayed post-traumatic stress syndrome, because I always narrate the story of what happened to me late D-Day afternoon on Omaha Beach, when a fragment of a mortar shell went through my helmet and nearly killed me. I lay 24 hours wounded on the beach before I got any medical help, and the hole in my helmet turned out to be the largest ever seen in history, according to the British War Museum. They wanted me to give it to them, and I told them that if it was that interesting, I'd like to keep it to show to my grandchildren. So, needless to say, that was rather quite traumatic, particularly not getting any medical help.
Clint, were you on the first wave in D-Day? Hello? Clint?
Richard?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, were you on the first wave in D-Day?
No, far from it. I landed at 9 o'clock in the morning, which was the 13th wave.
Wow. So when you see, can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
Of course I can. It's my show. When you see movies, like World War II movies, or like Saving Private Ryan, which had this whole montage for the first 15 minutes about the landing. First of all, do you watch these films, or do you just say, "What do I need to watch it for? I was there"?
No, I've seen Saving Private Ryan at least 3 times.
Wow! And how realistic was that film, or was it?
I thought that film was done very, very well. It looked like it was shot in Ireland, as I understand it, but it looked very much like the cliff that we had above us on Omaha Beach. And the initial shots of the engineers being killed in the water, sort of floating in blood and all that gory opening scene, was quite realistic. When I landed, their dead bodies were all over the beach. There were over 150 bodies right in front of our boat. In fact, we had to be careful not to land right on top of them when we put our ramp down.
Wow. Mary, you were stateside, correct? Your memoir talked about, if I remember correctly, what it was like to serve as a spouse at home on an air base. Am I correct?
Right. But, I'd like to answer the question you just asked Clint, because
sure.
you asked what he thought of when
sure.
he thought of D-Day and Memorial Day.
Sure.
And for me, it isn't D-Day specifically that comes back, but it's the feeling a memory of the whole feeling in the country at that time when the war was going on, and the unity of the country, and the feeling that we're going to win this. It was never a question of victory. It was just a question of when.
Right.
And it was a very special, extraordinary time to be part of it. Everyone wanted to do their bit. And, of course, it's particularly remarkable to look back on that, given the Vietnam War and Iraq and the others, where when the men came back, they were not heroes, as every veteran of World War II was. And they weren't heroes not because they weren't heroes, but just because of the mixed feeling of the nation about whether or not we should have fought the war. And it was just an extraordinarily unique time of great national unity that I wonder if we've had it since. I was just a little New Hampshire girl. I got married. I'd never been west of Ohio or south of New Jersey. And I married and went to an Air Force base in Kansas, where for the first time I saw a landscape that petered out just as far as you could see, and nothing, everything I'd ever seen, and there's neither ocean or hills. And but it was B-29s, and they were unique, very unique and special plane. If you remember, they're the ones that ultimately carried the bombs that were dropped on Japan.
Right.
And they were the plane that was created for long-range bombing. They could go 5,200 or something miles, whereas the old 17, the longest one before, could only go 2,000. But when they first came out, they were just full of bugs. They were rushed into action before they'd had testing, as they usually did. And that was where we were in Kansas with the very first group, one of the bases of several, where the very first time they had brought the pilots back from overseas, so there was rank all over the place. And the guys didn't like the plane. They didn't trust it. One of them even said, I remember, how can we trust this thing when it can't even handle the calm skies over Kansas? They had a lot of engine problems, and they kept catching on fire, and the planes kept crashing with mechanicals. And it was a heady time.
Wow. And to just talk for a second, either one of you, the difference now, we've been fighting a war for over a decade, and it's almost as if it's like been relegated to the back pages of the newspaper. What's your feeling now with how the country responds to war and this? My sense, that when you in the World War II, there was this sense of unity, as Mary is saying. But how do you explain? How do you relate to this period of time now in America?
Well, speaking for myself, I hardly blame people for being war weary and anxious to get out of Afghanistan, and I personally was not at all enthusiastic about our going into Iraq. And of course, I also recall the Vietnam era when I questioned that war before we got into it and during the time. But I do recall that even though I was among those in this college community that led opposition to the war, I never felt any opposition to the troops. And I've often felt that there was a misleading view that those of us who were opposed to the war had any negative feelings about our returning troops. But that has been reported, and it didn't seem to me to be the case in New England.
Wow. We're talking with Clint Gardner and Mary Jenkins about their book of World War II Remembered and their memories and reactions to this interesting period of time between Memorial Day and the anniversary of D-Day. This is a reminder that this portion of Boomer Generation Radio is brought to you by Kendal Outreach, serving the field of aging by raising public awareness and advocacy around important issues of older adults. Through education, training, and implementation of comprehensive approaches to safe, individualized, long-term care practices, Kendal Outreach has been sharing Kendal's approach to quality care with consumers, advocates, providers, government agencies, and related organizations since 1989. To learn more, visit kendal.org, that's KENDAL.org, and click on the Outreach icon, that's KENDAL.org. Click on Outreach. Again, we're speaking with Clint Gardner and Mary Jenkins here on Boomer Generation Radio on WWDB AM 860 and streaming live on WWDBAM.com. And again, a reminder that if you have comments for the show or suggestions, please email us at boomergenerationradio@gmail.com. Clint, I do want to return to this one thing that you were in D-Day. You were on that first day. You were at the Battle of the Bulge, and you helped liberate a concentration camp, the Buchenwald camp. I got to ask you about what was that like? What was that like to walk into that camp? What was the experience? What was the smell like? What was the feel like? What were the people like?
Yes, well, I can certainly give you a detailed description of what it was like the day we got into Buchenwald. We actually arrived a full week after it had been liberated by the Third Army. I was in the First Army. I'd left my combat outfit and had joined a military government team that had been told that we would be put in charge of Buchenwald upon its liberation. But General Patton had liberated Buchenwald instead of his Third Army had beaten us to Buchenwald, and therefore we weren't able to take over our job until a week late. Third Army had left all the bodies that were all over the crematorium yard and other places in the camp, something like 400 or 500 bodies, right where they were, because General Patton had said he wanted the camp left as it was so that the press and visiting dignitaries could see it. It was the first camp liberated, even though we were beyond some other camps. It was before Dachau or Bergen-Belsen. And it was also one of the largest of the concentration camps. Well, when we arrived that morning, things were still almost, must have been like they were on the first day, because there were bodies all around the crematorium yard. They had just begun to pick them up that day. And we were surrounded by Buchenwald prisoners who wanted to tell us who they were. They were speaking in many languages. I happen to speak German, so they would say, "Ich bin Deutsch," and ich war hier 10 Jahre. I was here 10 years. And I spoke a little Russian. There were 7,000 Russians in the camp. People don't know that Buchenwald was not primarily for Jews. In fact, there were hardly more than 5,000 or 10,000 Jews in the camp at any one time, and there were typically 20,000 prisoners in total there. So actually, the Jewish population, I overstated there, was more like 1,000 or 2,000 usually. Elie Wiesel was one of those we liberated on that at that time, and he and I undoubtedly saw each other because I would walk through the hospital where there were he was in the hospital, and there were 3,000 patients there. About 15 years ago, I met Elie Wiesel and gave him a camp map that I had kept, and we discussed the liberation, how his father had died in the first week after he reached Buchenwald from Auschwitz. And many people confuse the concentration camps with the extermination camps. Buchenwald, horrible as it was not an extermination camp. There was no plan to kill Jews there. They died in large numbers because they were in a segregated area, and they did not participate in the work program. But most of the 20,000 people at Buchenwald were involved in armament factories and other work, and were thus given enough food and enough health care so they could function.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you stay? If I remember something that you, in preparing, that you were an acting commander. You were acting commander or in charge of the camp?
I became acting commander. It was a rather unusual situation. I was the second in command of the military government team.
Oh, okay.
There were 4 officers, but we had been at the camp only a week when Captain Ball, my senior, delegated me to be camp commander, acting commander, because he had to be away from the camp about 2/3 of his time. The reason was that he was given command as well of Nordhausen, which was a worse camp than Buchenwald, excuse me, and also of Ohrdruf, which was a sub-camp of Buchenwald and considerably worse. The death rates there and the treatment of the prisoners were simply awful. So he was away, and I was on the spot, and I was leading the delegations from the British Parliament and the American Congress around. Mm-hmm. I was also the first person, perhaps not the first person, but I was among the first people to show the press and the visiting dignitaries the human skin that Ilse Koch, the wife of the prior commander, had made into lampshades and purses and all sorts of odds and ends.
What did that feel? I have to ask you, what did that, when you looked at that and you showed these people, what went through your mind? Was it totally surreal? Or what was it?
Surreal is a good way of describing it. We had never even contemplated that a person could be so incredibly tortured in their mind that they would take skin off people and use it for knickknacks. The skin most of it was taken from homosexuals who had obscene pictures on their backs, so that it was decorated skin. And she had asked that when homosexual prisoners arrived with these designs on them, on their skin, if she could have their I think I asked the prisoners whether she had them killed, and I'm still unclear whether they were occasionally killed promptly for her to get, or whether they waited until these prisoners died, which would have happened probably within the first year or two after their being there.
How long did you stay at the camp?
I stayed until we turned it over to the Russians. We arrived on about April 15th, and I stayed there until July 4th.
Wow. So I can't even imagine what went through your mind in those 2 months. It's reduced to a paragraph in a history book, but you walked the walk, you lived it. So thank you for your service. Do you ever see? By the way, have you ever? I'm sure you have. Have you ever bumped into people from the camp now, years later?
No, I have not met the survivors of Buchenwald, other than Elie Wiesel.
Wow, Mary, this book.
I'd like Richard. Can I break in? We have a few minutes left because I have something I really like to say.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
When we're celebrating D-Day, which is the 70th anniversary, not only celebrating the heroism of those guys, I hope we can also celebrate and remember with enormous pride the reaction of the U.S. in that situation. It was just the nation really rose as one in a united way to win that war. And as everyone knows, or should know, we contributed 2/3 of all the war materials that were used in that war. And that's, of course, including the things, that's for all the Allies, not just the U.S. Mm-hmm. And as an example of that, at the end of the war, we were producing 129 airplanes a day.
Right.
Which is just mind-boggling. And through the course of the war, we produced, 26 battleships, and it's just an extraordinary record, and it was all because of the united way in which the country went about winning. And I think we should be celebrating that and having great pride in what our nation accomplished and what it's capable of doing under stress.
Thank you for that. I really do thank you for that. It's a message that I think needs to be broadcast loud and clear continually, not just on, on occasion once or twice a year, but continually. And Before we come back to Clint and Mary, I just want to remind all of you that this portion of Boomer Generation Radio has been brought to you by Kendal, a system of not-for-profit communities and services that advocates for and empowers older adults to reach their full potential. Together, we are transforming the experience of aging, and to learn more about Kendal, which is Kendal, again, we invite you to visit kendal.org or call toll-free at 888-759-0128. That's 888-759-0128. Tell them you heard about it on Boomer Generation Radio. We have about 2 minutes left, Mary and Clint. As we march through this period from Memorial Day to the 70th anniversary of D-Day, Mary, Clint, what's, from each one of you very quickly, what's the one prayer that you have? What's the one message that you have for our listening audience about this moment?
Well, I think that when I think of D-Day, I think of how we all assumed that the Army could make no mistake and everything would go right, but everything went wrong. So I think one should remember that war is a highly risky and unlikely proposition to get involved in, and the more you stay out of them, the better off you'll be. I'll turn to
Mary.
Well, I've sort of said my piece on that subject, but I think also we need to keep in mind the horrors of war as well, as Clint said, because the sacrifices asked and, in this case, performed and received by the nation were horrendous. And for all the other nations involved, it was a catastrophic affair. And obviously the world wants to avoid this kind of thing in the future as best it can.
And if somebody wanted to get hold of this book, World War II Remembered, how do they do that, Mary?
Well, the easiest way to do it is to go online to UPNE, U-P-N-E, that is University Press of New England, UPNE.com, and that will take you directly to our publishers. And it's also available on Amazon.
We want to thank Clint Gardner and Mary Jenkins for really walking us through some fascinating stories and memories of World War II on this very special moment in American history between Memorial Day and the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And again, the book is World War II Remembered, and you can go at upne.org, and that'll take you right to the site. Clint, Mary, continued good health, success, much love, and joy in your life. Thank you very, very much for being with us on Boomer Generation Radio. To all of you, see you next week. Take care. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.